I think a lot of people have the misconception that if you're in law enforcement, you automatically support the death penalty, and that's not the case. In fact, many members of law enforcement find the death penalty to be an ineffective tool, a waste of valuable resources, and a false promise to victims' family members.
I have been deeply interested and constantly surrounded by the ongoing debate concerning the death penalty throughout my law enforcement and teaching career. My personal view, one of opposition to the death penalty, may not be a popular view with some of my close colleagues in law enforcement, but I've come to find that I am not alone in my view, and that when the issues are put on the table and critically and honestly evaluated, I've learned that many more in law enforcement share many of the same concerns that I have. You'll hear about some of those concerns from speakers here today as well. The one point that I want to make on this issue is this. The death penalty does not deliver on any of the promises that claim to be at the very source of its strength. Death penalty support claims to be a mile wide, but it's clearly only an inch deep. The people who end up suffering the most are the surviving victims' family members who've been promised that the death penalty will put an end to their misery and bring them the closure that they've been looking for. We know from those victims who have already come forward and spoken, and we'll hear from one who's here today, that the death penalty does not bring closure or put an end to their misery.
In all the years that I have been involved in the criminal justice system, I've come to this position today. The death penalty should be abolished for one reason. It's wrong. It is wrong to kill someone. If it's wrong for a murderer to take a life, how is it right for the state to take a life? And if one murderer is going to be executed, why not execute all murderers? How do you get to pick and choose who shall live and who shall die? As a prosecutor, it would have been within my discretion to determine which cases to prosecute as capital cases. What special wisdom do I have? Of course, I could be governed by the statutes. Does it meet the statutory criteria? But it's still a discretionary call. So whose murder is worse than somebody else's? If your child is murdered, is that a worse murder than if your mother is murdered? What if it's a homeless person who nobody knows and nobody cares about? Is that not so bad a murder? If it's wrong to kill, it's wrong to kill. And if we're going to then say, but some killings are okay, how do we pick and choose which ones? My main reason in opposition to the death penalty is because it's simply never right to take a life. State-sanctioned killing is murder too.
On October 18, 1999, almost 10 years ago this year, I received a phone call in the middle of the night and learned that my 19-year-old niece, Maggie, a college sophomore, had been shot and killed at her school in Michigan by her ex-boyfriend. He then used the same gun to kill himself. As I tried to take in this shocking news, all I could think of was this was another senseless act of violence, but this time, Maggie, our Maggie, was dead. Suddenly I was transformed from being an attorney who had worked for years as an advocate for crime victims and abused women into a crime victim myself as a survivor of homicide. Over the years since my niece's death, and particularly when I was appointed in 2002 to serve on the Commission to Study the Death Penalty, which was created by the Connecticut General Assembly, I have thought a lot about what might have happened if my niece's death was not a case of murder-suicide, but that the man who killed her had in fact survived after her death. How would my family have reacted if we too would have been plunged into the criminal justice system and sought revenge there against the man who killed her? I can't say today how my entire family might have what my entire family might have decided then, but I do know that our thinking and wishes about the imposition of the death penalty would have been different than any other family in the same situation. For as I stand here today, I can only speak of my own feelings and what I have done to cope, process, and heal from this horrible act of having a loved one murdered. I can't speak for another family, nor can they speak for me. But in a recent statement, Governor Jody Rell said, and I quote, I fully understand the anguish and outrage of the families of victims who believe, as I do, there are certain crimes so heinous, so fundamentally revolting to our humanity that the death penalty is warranted, unquote. It's not accurate to imply that all families of all victims of homicide believe one thing or the other about the death penalty, even in what the governor called the most heinous of crimes. For myself, I believe the imposition of the death penalty would have been a more painful path to healing for me, and that the usual arguments for the death penalty do not hold much sway for me in light of the circumstances of how Maggie died. First, the prospect of the death penalty certainly did not deter the man who killed her from taking the action he took in October of 1999. Whether or not the state of Michigan, where the homicide was committed, had the death penalty, and in fact it doesn't, it did not sway him from committing this crime. Excuse me. The fact that he committed suicide after killing Maggie shows how little he valued his own life as well as hers. Second, to say that capital punishment is often the only penalty that matches the horrific nature of some crimes, or that the only finality of an execution can bring closure for the victims, is also not true in every situation. I do not believe that I will ever have closure about my niece's death. But that's not what I'm seeking. There are two things that I do want. First, I've always wanted to be sure that this man would not harm anyone else or put another family through what we've gone through. That he killed himself has certainly ensured that outcome. But had he lived, I believe that having him serve a life sentence without parole would have achieved this goal without taking yet another human life.
I retired from the Connecticut Department of Correction in 2002 as a deputy warden. I did my time. 27 years I did in Connecticut's correctional facilities, from volunteer to counselor to deputy warden to warden. A good number of other former Department of Correction personnel would have been here if they could. During our active employment in the Department of Correction, we all worked with lifers. Believe me, and believe the other retired DOCers, when I tell you that it is no picnic to do a life sentence in prison. We avow that life in prison, without the possibility of release, is a civilized, severe, and just sentence for those who commit serious, heinous, horrific felony crimes.
Because of my extensive experience in corrections, I can tell you that the death penalty is not an effective or necessary tool. To say that the death penalty is needed to protect correctional staff shows a lack of understanding of how prisons operate. Effective safety procedures and regulations are what keep our prisons safe, not the death penalty. We know that the death penalty does not deter crime, but its problems do not stop there. Across this country, we have many innocent individuals on death row. So far, 133 death row inmates have been exonerated since 1973. We know that the poor and minorities are disproportionately represented in our prisons and on death row. If we are honest, we recognize that you get just as much justice as you can afford, and that race is a very significant factor in the criminal justice system, and, of course, in the imposition of the death penalty. We know that our judicial districts in Connecticut disproportionately apply the death penalty. We know that the death penalty will always be imposed in a random fashion that defies fundamental fairness due to the innumerable variables that affect the outcome of any given prosecution. We all have heard of botched executions in spite of the best efforts of officials. We have heard of the reluctance of health professionals to be involved in the execution of these death sentences. We all have heard of the states that have suspended executions due to their concerns for fairness and other humane concerns. The truth is that no rationale for the existence of the death penalty remains. By keeping capital punishment in place, we keep alive a system characterized by bias that puts innocent lives at risk of being executed, and it needs to end. Our law enforcement apparatus cannot and never will be fairly able to, and without possibility of error, able to administer the death penalty. The existence of the death penalty harms society as a whole, and thus it should be abolished. Governor Rell, I urge you to eliminate the death penalty in Connecticut.